Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Andy Boyd, the marketing coordinator for TCG Books, and I use he, him pronouns. I am a white man with dark brown hair wearing a pink button-up shirt. I'm so excited to introduce this TCG Books Presents event featuring Lauren Yi, Haruna Lee, Shayok Misha Chowdhury, and Dr. Yon Kim on the past, present, and future of Asian American and Pacific Islander drama. This event is part of TCG's Plays for the People campaign, the goal of which is to increase access to dramatic literature for a significant number of individuals and emphasize the play as a rich and contemporary form of literature. We'll now take a moment to offer our respects to the many lands on which we gather and to honor the traditional stewards of these lands. If you have a land acknowledgement as part of your personal or organizational practice, we invite you to share it in the comments now. While you do, I'll read the land acknowledgement posted in TCG's office. Theater Communication Group's offices are located on the Lenape Island of Manahatta in Lenape-Hoking, the Lenape homeland. We honor the generations of stewardship the Lenape and all Native peoples have given to the water, air, and land. As guests, we pay respect to the Lenape peoples, past, present, and future, here in their homeland and throughout the Lenape diaspora. While acknowledgement is important, it is not enough. That's why TCG has put together a webpage with multiple ways you can support Native-led movements for justice, and we'll share a link to that page in the chat now. Now, before we get started, I want to thank the partners and supporters who have made this event possible. TCG Books Presents is supported in part by the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, along with public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council and generous individual donors like you. We are also supported by a generous grant from the Mellon Foundation and by the National Endowment for the Arts. If you'd like to support events like this and all of TCG's programs, from our federal arts advocacy to our ED&I initiatives, please visit tcg.org/donate or click the link that we're sharing now. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Lauren Yi is a playwright and screenwriter. Her plays include Cambodian Rock Band with music by Dengue Fever, The Great Leap, and King of the Yees. Cambodian Rock Band and The Great Leap and other plays are forthcoming from TCG Books. Haruna Lee, they, them, is a Taiwanese-Japanese-American theater maker, screenwriter, educator, and community steward. Their plays include War Lesbian, Memory Retrograde, Plural Love, and Suicide Forest, for which they received an Obie Award for playwriting and conception. Suicide Forest was on the 2020 Kilroy's list and is published by our partner publisher, 53rd State Press. Shayok Misha Chowdhury is the Obie and Whiting Award-winning writer and director of Public Obscenities, recently named one of 3 finalists for the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Public Obscenities is forthcoming from TCG Books. Currently, he is collaborating with his physicist mother on a concert memoir called Rayology, for which he was awarded a Sundance Asian American Fellowship. The piece will premiere at the Bushwick Star next year as a co-production with Here Arts Center and Mayi Theater Company. Dr. Yon Kim is the Patsy Takamoto Mink Professor of English at Harvard University. Her research and teaching interests include modern and contemporary American literature and theater, with a particular focus on Asian American culture. Her first book, The Racial Mundane, Asian American Performance and the Embodied Everyday, received the Lois P. Rudnick Book Prize from the New England American Studies Association. Kim serves on the board of Company One Theater. And now I'll turn it over to our panelists.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Andy, for those wonderful introductions, and thank you to TCG Books for inviting me to moderate this panel with 3 playwrights and theater artists whose work I really admire quite a bit. So this really is such a privilege and a pleasure. So given that part of what motivated this event is AAPI Heritage Month, I wanted to start with a question that I think, I hope people will take up in any way that inspires them. And that is, what has been the value of the term Asian American or Asian American Pacific Islander more broadly for you in your work? And thinking about the second part of it, heritage, right? What are the ways in which heritage has been something that has been of interest to you? I would say that there's some way that has, at least from your works, there's a way that has been of interest to you. In what other ways has it been perhaps like a site of trouble or challenge? So a 2-pronged question, but please take it any way you like.
Oh, what
I'm
a
happy to have people jump in or raise their
No, it's just such a good question. I'm like, I didn't mean to start speaking first, but I guess I just, I feel like I think about the way in which identifying as Asian American was a thing because I'm Bengali and I grew up as like an Indian kid in Wayland, Massachusetts. It's wild to think now. It feels so. I'm like, oh yeah, of course I'm being invited to be part of an Asian American Pacific Islander like month event. But if you had told me in high school that I was Asian American, I would have been surprised because that wasn't language that was language that we were sort of using to, or at least South Asians were using. South Asian also, that's a word that I didn't sort of like have for myself in high school. And so I think about how, well, I guess just from a sort of like positive place, I feel like these sort of like complicated broad groupings, if I'm being sort of like optimistic about it, these are like, my grandfather had like very like weird feelings about Chinese people, right? It's like we were not like it's not like, ah, yes, these are people that should be in the same bucket. But I feel like in the diaspora, there's been an opportunity like through that kind of grouping for, like the three of us to be in conversation with each other in a way that we might not sort of like have been otherwise, for better or for worse, but I think for better. I guess that's just the first thing that comes to mind around like the first part of the question.
Yeah. I think I will jump in and say too, yeah, just like I think the ability to kind of come together and harness like our political power, because I think Misha is right that there is so much history when you think about kind of the relationship between different Asian countries, and that all the people for who fall under this like umbrella term of Asian American were 50, 100 years ago in Asia fighting with one another. It's kind of wild to see how this term of Asian American is us. I don't think saying that we are all the same or that like differences don't exist, but that there are some commonalities in our history about how we're treated in this country, about I don't know, just like certain ways that we can come together and support one another. And I feel like that's exciting.
Yeah, I feel like both of you have pointed so beautifully to the complexity of this word. And I find like the usefulness of it is in remembering a history of mine of growing up here in America and feeling so lost within its whiteness and its capitalism and its hegemony, all of that, and finding like this bright light and being able to connect with that word, and then finding others and building community with others who identify as Asian American and finding a second home or a second family, being an immigrant too. It's like, how do we find those things here in the US? And then the difficulty, this tricky, sticky stuff with that word for me, I think that like the blanket Asian American doesn't cover the individual, what I'm holding within. So like, I feel like we've been talking about the discord amongst just Asians, period. And I feel that so acutely in my body, being Japanese and Taiwanese, and then feeling like, I learned Japanese. I grew up in Japan, Japanese imperialism, like how much that is present just in my family. And then everything that's Taiwan or culturally, language, the food, the family, it's just kind of like become a ghostly presence for me. And that I feel so complicated around that and how to hold that. Yeah.
Yeah, like I think there is just to sort of name the fraughtness of like simultaneously it allows for this kind of like a category under which a certain kind of solidarity and politics is possible. And then also there is a, like, I mean, I guess my play Public Obscenities was such a Bengali play. Like it was such a like this, and sometimes when something is that specific, I don't know how to describe it. Like it felt, like around like, like I'm like, oh, do I want, like, I'm like, there are, it's like, but the play being bilingual, like I was like, oh, it feels more sort of relevant to me to have like a Bengali affinity night, because it's about like having people in the room that can speak the language that this specific play is about. So I feel like there is this sort of like constant negotiation of the like particular and then the sort of like the broad. But I appreciate what you were saying, Haruna, about, yeah, like how, because I think even like I'm like half the cast of my play was Bangladeshi and half the cast was West Bengali. And even that, like already, like it's like, it is sort of wild to me that we are able to do anything under the term Asian American, because literally it is so massive. The fact that we like managed to sort of forge forward in any way, given how, like, it's just like my parents, I don't think my parents have like East Asian friends. You know what I mean? Like it's like like India in and of itself is such a sort of massive, like, yeah, I think we as the sort of like children of immigrants get to build these tethers that feel so strange and foreign, perhaps to our parents.
Yeah.
Well,
I was going to say,
go ahead. Go ahead, Lauren.
it was, I think like a year ago, I was like talking to some artists that I identified as like Asian American. And I mentioned the term, I was like, oh, like we have this event for May. It's like AAPI month. And they were like, I do not know what you are talking about. Like, what is AAPI? Because it does feel like we're constantly, I think, like coming up with these terms and reinterpreting it and like figuring out what it means to us, which I think is a good thing. But it's also interesting to see across like generations how identity manifests. And Misha, in terms of kind of the idea of like having a Bengali specific night, or even like having, the four of us here to represent AAPI month, makes me think about, I think there was this writer who wrote about gatherings, and like the idea of like a successful gathering is having an idea of like why we are gathering and being purposeful and not just necessarily doing what is expected. I think the example being like, okay, well, what is a bridal shower and why do you have it? And there's like the traditional way you can view it of like, it has this and it has these games and it has these things, or to look at the purpose to be like, oh, it's this particular traditional ritual around which, someone who is about to get married is surrounded by people who have gone through it and gained support in that way. And so just like that idea of like why we gather and what the purpose is.
Yeah, I really love that idea. And I do think that every time you group anything together, right, under the AAPI banner, there is that reinvention. And I love the thought of being purposeful in every instance. And I will say that when I've, grouped works of literature or your plays, right, under that banner, I think it's great for students in some ways to come in with one idea of it, but the hope is that they actually leave with another idea. And I think that all three of you and contemporary dramatists who might fit in that category have really been doing that work by kind of expanding what we might consider to be Asian American drama. And I think related to that, in terms of similarities and differences, something I've noticed across your plays and across sort of a larger set of plays as well is exactly what you brought up, Misha, this the kind of the thoughtfulness around how language is portrayed on the American stage. If you're trying to portray bilingual, multilingual communities, or stories that are traversing, right, national borders, there's a way that you have to confront the problem or the possibility or the opportunity provided by different languages and presenting that to largely English-speaking audiences, right? And so I would love for each of you to perhaps talk a little bit about how you made certain choices, right, in bringing that kind of multilinguality to the stage.
That's such a beautiful question. I really come up against and with language. I don't want to make it such an antagonistic relationship, but when I first wrote Suicide Forest, I was really inspired by Adrienne Kennedy's Funny House of a Negro and how she was able to capture this like psychic landscape, this interiority. And so I was like, yeah, let me try to capture this interiority of Japaneseness and Japanese culture. But I wrote the play entirely in English with the hopes of utilizing English as a way to capture a tone or a sensibility to me that feels so strikingly Japanese. And I could not get anyone to understand. Anyone from the American theater was like, we have no idea what this is. What the hell is going on in this play? And it wasn't until I met Aya Ogawa, who ended up directing this play, and we had worked on it for, I think, like 5 or 6 years. But it was in finding a collaborator who could read the layers of that, of what language was doing. And she was like, first she said, this play is disgusting and horrifying, but I can't put it down. And then she said, this play, even though it's written in English, reads like a translation to me. Somehow you've captured an essence of translation. And so then we started to really push into that and think about what is the performativity of translation? How are we mirroring the kind of translation that is happening in the text within our bodies, the bodies that we put on stage? And that really like opened up. So like, I feel like there's a version of the play where we could have cast all Asian American English speaking actors, but instead we decided to really push into Japanese heritage actors who English is their second language. And that was a very kind of thoughtful choice on our part. And so like the muscularity of English within the body became like an entire texture for the play.
Yeah, I mean, and I also just I am newer to my training is as a director, and I think even though for like I've been a writer my whole life, but I think I had a particular like terror about like the kind of playwriting I ended up doing in Public Obscenities. And I've been following the two of your work for like I think of you as playwrights and I'm like, how am I a playwright? How it's so new to me. And I think that had to do with like I knew that my way into writing a play, like a play, eventually I would have to, because I myself am so like profoundly bilingual, I didn't understand how, and that experience of like, which is, I think, like a relatively, I felt sort of lonely in that language place in my community growing up. I think what made me rare, or what the sort of like protagonist in Public Obscenities, like what makes him rare to me is less his sexuality, or like it's like the fact of how hard he is working to retain his mother tongue, and that is like the like primary sort of like spine of his identity, is like the effort he is constantly putting in to sort of like passing as sort of like native, like being able to speak Bengali like like someone who didn't grow up in the Americas. And so that is like I started writing the play from that place. And so like it is literally about like the sort of like feeling of like holding onto your language so tight that you almost like strangle it or something. But then in the actual writing of the thing, it was a kind of like it was like I'm like I just wrote the play in as like quite literally it was just like I want everyone to speak exactly the way they would speak in this house. There were there were like and that was such a sort of wild undertaking because I didn't know that I could write in all those registers of Bengali. I didn't know I had access to them. And I think to speak to sort of like the Asian American like category too, I think I was very inspired by like seeing Minari and The Farewell, and like I was like, oh, film, we do this all the time in film. Why does it feel so radical and strange to like write a play that is more than 50% not in English in like a theater context? Yeah, and I sort of surprised myself in I just thought it would be an impossibility. Like I didn't think I could be able I didn't think I would be able to do it. I didn't think it would work. I didn't think we would be able to cast it. I didn't think anybody would like be interested in reading subtitles on a stage. So I think it was a kind of uh like I feel free. I feel like I am now able to be a playwright because I have sort of like taken out that sort of like block that was like, well, how are you going to write something that is like true to you if like you can't even write, you can't even transcribe a conversation between you and your parents and put it on stage in front of people because like that would be illegible to people. So it was a very kind of like nuts and boltsy kind of like relationship to like just being like, can I actually even get people to watch what my like a, a day in the life of me sounds like or something?
Yeah. I think unlike Haruna and Misha, I am monolingual. So like English is like the only playground that I um, get to play in, like with like a sense of fluency. And but I think at the same time, like I've always been interested in like the like cadences and like what it is to kind of speak in translation or try to like put other languages on stage in the context of English, if that makes sense. Of like, because I think I would watch people I knew who were multilingual move between different languages, and it was just, Haruna talks about like the muscularity of English, or just like that you got like a different essence when you move between languages, and like how to capture that musicality of a certain language in English and how to put that in a character. I feel like was always fascinating for me. And I think, like I haven't written in languages other than English, but like one of my plays had lyrics that were partly in Khmer, the Cambodian language, which was something that isn't my background and I don't speak. And we did that with no subtitles, because I think for us that the music in those songs were all, even the English language ones, were more out of a sense of like giving someone like the emotional weight of it through the music rather than being able to like understand what the lyrics were. Um, yeah, so I'm always fascinated by language. I'm very excited to hear the two of you talk about your work in that context.
I just want to add to that, Lauren. It's so beautiful you talk about the musicality of it, of like the multilingualness. It's making me think too, like how much across all three of our work, there is like the destabilizing of English. Like English becomes such a dominant entity or figure or presence in American theater, in plays. And our experience, though, is very much not that. So then to play with and fuck with and destroy or take apart English, to me becomes like a really cool experiment. Like, of course, we're trying to pick apart the dominance of English language in our plays because that's how we experience and build a relationship with this country. Yeah.
And I love how you're talking about, the both of you are talking about, because I'm realizing that the fact of public obscenities being bilingual was so, like, the fact that it was in that there were Bangla and English in the play was like the sort of like thing that was held up as what it was. But in fact, I think what was hardest for me were the different Englishes in the play, right? Like I was like, oh, I know I can write this character's Bangla, but can I write like how a like a 60-year-old Bangla medium school educated like woman in Calcutta talking to her partner nephew's Black American like the English, I was like, oh, do I have access to that English? There were like 7 different Englishes in the play. So like the destabilizing of the like I'm just sort of like, oh, that is also um like how Haruna you're talking about. Like it's like how we fuck with English has also to do with uh just like the fact that I mean like English is like the lingua franca in India, right? Like it is like that is the only language through which like we can move through I can move through the country of India and talk to people outside of Bengal. And it is, but I'm like, what is that the English that I speak with my parents and the English that and even the English that I speak with my like Indian friends born and raised here in the States, and people are like, you guys are putting like somebody the other day was just sort of like it's related to like weird humor stuff. And sorry, the lights have gone off in this rehearsal room, but like I'm like somebody was talking to me here, listening to me talk to my like collaborators on this piece the other day and being like, I still can't figure out like when you guys are like, are you being funny by slipping into this Indian accent or like, but it's just like such a like part of how we sort of like I feel like how I speak English is such a part of how I navigate my like place here. Yeah, thank you
Yeah.
for saying those, two of you.
I love this idea of decentering English in some ways, even in a play, right? That is mostly English. I think that's such a provocative and productive idea. And Lauren, I'm so glad you brought up Cambodian rock band because I was thinking about the very different experience of like listening to the dengue fever music and then hearing the dialogue, and how I think maybe across all 3 of the plays that you've mentioned, like there's a way the audience has to be okay with not necessarily understanding things like in a hypertextual way, right? That there are theatrical experiences to be had that go beyond simply like, I understand every sentence of this performance. I fear that I don't have a huge amount of time left to ask questions, even though I have a million in my head. So I just wanted to throw one more out. Maybe I'll get another one, but one more out, which is really, again, I think kind of geared towards maybe refining how each of you, I say I have time for a few more questions. Each of your plays are so distinct. Each of your styles, I think, have this really kind of palpably, different character. I think, again, that kind of speaks to how Asian American drama itself is so diverse, and it cannot be like defined in any particular, with a particular style or particular story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the style that I wouldn't want to say that there's only one style, right, that we could match up to each of you, but certainly Haruna, Suicide Forest is very experimental. I think I'm so glad you brought up Adrian Kennedy because that's where my mind went with that play. And Lauren, with your plays, I'm always laughing really hard, even when something's really serious. I love this like intensely comic sensibility that runs through your work. And Misha, I like the dialogue for me was so hyper realistic. Like I think the rhythm of it, again, like you feel like you're just like immersed, right, in this family setting. You're hearing everybody talk, and people are interrupting each other, and there's a million things going on. But it's almost like naturalistic, right, in the way that it sets you in that scene. So I'd love to hear about how you kind of found your distinct style or voice, and what that enabled you to do, right, in terms of the kind of theater that you wanted to produce for the world.
Yeah, I guess I'll start it off in that I think like finding my voice was a little bit about like thinking what kind of experience like I would want in the theater and like what would excite me, because I think like when you start, people are like, okay, read this play or this play, and you're like, okay, like your first couple plays like look like kind of bad Xeroxes of like, oh, this Paula Vogel play is so amazing, so this is how it has to be done. Or like, okay, I read Edward Albee, so like this is what a play is supposed to be like. And you could go you could do all that. But eventually, I think for me, the thing that I love in an evening of theater is I love just like the gamut of emotions that I think like my plays find light and humor in really dark places, because I think like I crave that contrast of like I want to laugh, I want to deeply feel, I want to be surprised, and that I guess like I really deeply respect actors and the ensemble, and I always want to like give actors something that they would enjoy doing or would challenge them on stage. I feel like I'm responsible for a lot of actors becoming much better musicians, better tap dancers, better basketball players. I feel like those are areas where I'm like, ooh, like let's see what actors can do and like showcase their abilities. And then I just like have this theory that writers, there's a certain set of things that haunt each of us kind of individually, and that it's not always the case, but very frequently there are things that like we return to in our own work that may not be obvious to an audience. They'll be like, oh, this play was set in Paris and this play is set, today in Brooklyn, and they couldn't possibly be related, but like there's something in us that is like certain symbols or certain relationships feel like we return to again and again. Like I write a lot of family plays, I write a lot of history plays. I have a lot of sunsets and I have a lot of sunrises actually in my work. And I just find it fascinating. And I feel like for me, at least, it sometimes helps me when I'm stuck as a writer, because I'll just be like, okay, what do you usually write about? Is it that this time? And sometimes that is the helpful answer of like, oh, that's how these two things are connected. Yeah.
Well, I love this, the repetition or return of themes and objects. I was thinking like, oh yeah, urns for me. Also like holes and portals and like doorways that are not quite the right size. And just like liminal, like in between, like always a character somehow passing through a liminal space, and that space feeling like, I don't know, a kind of queerness or a kind of like Asianness too. Yeah, I come from a lineage of experimental theater makers, and that I was working with a lot of artists who really made their work in the 60s and 70s, and somehow I kind of got thrown in with these companies acting, with like the Talking Band and Ralph Lee and the Meadowy River Theater Company, Yoshiko Chuma, Keith McDermott. I don't know, there's like these people who I really learned firsthand what theater could look like, and they were really working with like the unknown, the dark spaces, this kind of like sublimity of what performance doesn't have to make sense, logical sense, but what happens if you invent your own logic? And what if that logic pushes so hard that we're in illogic or nonsense space? And so then I feel like, like Misha, I began as a performer and then started pushing into writing. And writing was really only like a map or tool or something to try to get to that performance, the performance that I wanted to see. Like you said, Lauren. And so then, yeah, eventually, like people like Mac Wellman and Sybil Kempson, and I've performed with Taylor Mac, but I felt so moved by Taylor's work too, and the maximalist, the color, the bombardment, all of that feels really present. Maybe it's just a pastiche. Maybe we are a pastiche of all of the artists that we've come across and connected with.
Yeah, I love the way you both are talking about. Yeah, I think, and again, I feel like, I'm turning 40 in December, and I feel like in the writing of this, like, I feel like I just was like reborn as a playwright or something. And I didn't, and it's actually quite, because Haruna, I, I gravitate towards the universe that you're describing. I also feel like the kind of theater that I have always been sort of wowed by or drawn to is actually quite different than the play I ended up writing. Like, especially because I'm a director, like, I don't know that I ever would have chosen to direct my play. Like that I would have been like, yes, this is the kind of thing that uh and so it is actually like I discovered this other voice in the writing of this play. And I have always been, and then I realized that thing that I'm attracted to, that sort of I discovered in the writing, isn't that far from like what we might call experimental, because like it is this kind of like hyper, like I was really moved by the Mad Ones' Mrs. Murray's Menagerie at Ars Nova a few years ago. There's a lot of like plays that I love where people are like, nothing happened. Why, like, what happened? Nothing happened. People talked and then they left. Which also gets sort of like called sort of like weird or experimental in this weird way, even though it is like uh sort of reaching towards that sort of like granular naturalism, fly on the wally kind of dialogue writing that you were talking about, Chuyan. But I didn't like, it's not like I set out to write that. I just sort of, um, I think that I just discovered that I like sort of listening to like the kind of writing that I'm currently just sort of attracted to is it's very like micro, like I'm thinking like just about the music of like it's like, oh, this is where this is how to choreograph like 1 minute of conversation that feels sort of like ebullition, and I have no idea what the scene is going to be about, but like I would be like it like nerds, I feel like a weird nerd about like I would be like, oh, can I write a scene that sounds like this panel that we're having? What's the music of it? What's the sort of like silence inside of it? And how do I suddenly choose to breathe on the like which of us chooses to speak first? I don't know. It's just like a strange sort of attraction to the music of dialogue that I sort of like leaned into in the writing of this play, and I'm still sort of following in the plays that I'm writing now. But it does feel like a strange, like like I'm approaching that kind of naturalism from a very like weird place in my brain, because I could like I do like I'm not a it's not like I consume a lot of family dramas, but then I like wrote a family drama that is like maybe too like weird or some too weirdly naturalistic or something.
Misha, I'm going to look for your next play called The Panel, and I will how you capture the musicality of our conversation. I think I have to cede my time over to Andy now for Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful discussion, everybody. I really enjoyed listening to that. We're going to turn it over to some questions and comments from our audience. The first one is by Catherine, who writes, Misha, I loved your play so much. I am a Persian director, and I saw elements of my own culture in it and also discovered things about Bengali society that I did not know. So to kind of transform that into a question, which I'll put all of you, how much do you think about that kind of process of plays both being kind of a window and a mirror, seeing your own culture through it, but also other people maybe seeing aspects of their culture? Misha, I know I also teach a class at Hunter College. I actually brought my class to your play, and I don't think any of the students in that particular section were Bengali, but a lot of them said that they saw elements of, you know, their aunts or their uncles or their parents in that play. Is that something you guys think about consciously, or do you just kind of drill down in the specificity and trust that it will resonate more broadly?
I mean, I do think it's well, Lauren, you go. You were about to speak.
No, but I feel like the question was in your direction, so you go first.
No, I just think what you just said is right. I mean, I do think it is the specificity is like, I think about the things that I've seen that have given me permission to like be as specific in sort of my brain and universe are the pieces that are like, so like, you know, my mentor was Shari Mura. I grew up with these sort of like queer Chicana like why do I know so much about why do I know so much about that particular universe? It's because there was like a really sort of robustly developed community of like writers and artists that sort of like gathered themselves around the like flame that was Shari Moraga when I was an undergrad at Stanford. And I didn't have like a, you know, Bengali mentor to turn to, but it was like, I was like, oh, maybe I can do something like this in my world. So yeah, that's just to say, I don't have like, it's not like any of my great sort of like people that I have learned from have been people that speak my language or are from my culture. It's like through their insistence on my own being specific to me that I have like been able to do that, I think, or had the confidence to do that.
I guess for me, I think the things that I know about my work is that like whatever the world is, I think you try to build in a way that feels like as specific. And like if someone from that world came and watched it, they'd be like, oh, you got that right. Even if like no one else on like in the audience gets it, you're like, oh, like when I wrote a play about my dad, the thing that I think I was proudest of, which, you know, probably did not matter to most people, that I was like, that's actually what he's like. And that the people who knew him were like, oh, okay, that feels familiar. But I think at the same time, my work in particular comes at it from an American lens and I write with an American audience in mind. Like I actually think a lot of my plays, like the sense of humor and the references read very much to an American audience, that when people are like, oh, I wonder how this play would play in Asia, or like, have you brought it to Cambodia? I was like, oh, there's a lot of things that feel like distinctly kind of like third culture that may be recognizable to an American audience, but might feel totally opaque to say an audience in China or an audience in Cambodia, like even if you were to like translate it. So I feel like that's something that feels specific to my work.
Move on to our next question, which is from Morgan, which is, do you have any shows that you've read or seen recently that have stuck in your mind, or are there any shows that are coming up that you're looking forward to?
I will share mine, and then unfortunately I have to go. One is like the show that I've loved recently is David Adjemi's Stereophonic, just because I think the central question is about like, why do we work on this thing that may be killing me? Which I feel like as artists or as anyone who cares deeply about something, um, I was like, can relate to. And then the thing that I haven't seen that I'm excited by is like to go see Oh Mary, which is like transferring. And I've only heard amazing things from people who had like a wonderful time. So I can't wait to see that. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Lauren.
Keep talking.
Yeah, oh gosh, I've seen a lot of stuff. I saw Here Are the Blueberries at New York Theater Workshop, which felt very, very topical to our time right now. It's talking about genocide. Bankson's show, the Keep Going songs, which I think sadly closed, but that felt like such a salve to our aching, weeping hearts at the moment. And yeah, oh, and then I saw El Nino at the Met, which really, it's so rare that I get to see opera, but there was something really fantastic about just seeing, and maybe all operas do this, but to see that many people on stage together and singing really felt like a gesture of community. Like we're just with 50 people the whole time moving through the story, which felt yeah, profound. What about you, Misha?
I do. I mean, I I do just have to say I saw Raja Feather Kelly's The Fires at Soho Rep last night, and we were all Haruna and Raja and I were in Soho Rep's writer director lab together, and I was just so uh like uh unexpectedly wrecked by it. It was just such a sort of like the way it worked on me was um super unexpected, and I am just so excited as a sort of like accidental playwright by those of us who are sort of like finding their ways into playwriting at sort of like funny junctures in our lives. And anyways, that was just sort of like like unapologetically sort of like elegiac kind of like it was just I mean I don't know whether but I was telling my partner it reminded me of how I felt when I walked out of the Hours in high school and just sat there in the movie theater and my parents were like, "Are you okay? Like, do we have to what's happening? What has happened to our child?" That's sort of how I felt walking out of Walker Space yesterday. And this is just like a weird I this is not theater, but I was just at a residency and I watched this movie that maybe everybody else in the world has seen, called Portrait of a Woman on Fire or Portrait d'une jeune fille en feu. And I was like, how did I miss this? It like like I was like this I was like I think I have found God or something through this movie. So those are the two things that I've seen recently. I've been out of town for 3 weeks, so I haven't seen anything other than Roger's show in a month, and it was stunning.
Hey, thank you so much. Oh, Dr. Kim, did you want to say something or? Oh, never mind. I thought I saw a movement. Okay, great. And finally, thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon. While today we're celebrating TCG Books, TCG does so much more than publishing. TCG exists to lead for a just and thriving theater ecology, from playwrights and play readers to theater artists, administrators, and audiences. Please visit tcg.org to learn more about our work. And to support TCG and TCG Books, please visit tcg.org/donate. To keep up to date with everything TCG Books, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at BooksTCG. And thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you at another book event soon. Okay, great. Thank you so much, everybody.